Alright guys, BLM here back with a new video, and in this video I'm back with another player ranking of a season that I've recently done a retrospective for, and here we'll be doing a player ranking for Big Brother Canada Season 1. Now, like my other season-based player rankings, this will be based on how I feel like they played across this season, not how they are as players in the grand scheme of it, and let's jump right into it. We have 15 players to rank here. Let's start off at number 15. The worst player of the season ends up being Danielle, the second boot of the season, who, to me, I just feel like made the most unforced errors, or at least the most unforced errors out of a relatively early boot. She was someone that was essentially out of the core power structure from the beginning, being aligned to the likes of Gary and Suzette, and had a pretty hostile relationship with Jillian, who becomes the second week HOH. However, despite that, the majority decides to not target Danielle because someone like a Gary is looked at as a bigger threat, and even a Neil is someone that had caught on to the core power structure. So Danielle was initially safe due to, again, really nothing that she actually did. But once Gary ends up winning the veto, she decides to offer herself up as a pawn. Now, technically, Jillian needed to find a replacement nominee anyway, and Danielle was one of those options for a replacement nom to begin with, to where even if she didn't volunteer, Danielle might have been the nominee anyway. But again, for her to just offer herself up in a position where they could have easily pawned someone like an AJ is definitely a suboptimal move here that obviously puts her in a lot of danger, to where by the time the vote ends up coming up, and Neil is able to wiggle his way back into the graces of the majority, while Danielle is someone that continued to isolate herself with the likes of Gary and Suzette, while also still remaining a hostile presence to the likes of Jillian, and really just came off as a pretty negative presence across the season as well. And through all these things, it really just makes her just such a bad player in every single way. Again, I don't know a single positive that there is to say about her outside the fact that she did have a very close friendship to, again, Gary, Suzette, Tala, but those were all the people on the outs. And realistically, I think in comparison to a lot of the earlier boots on this season, I don't think a lot of the earlier boots here are that bad. So because of that, for me, Danielle ends up being at the bottom here at number 15. Now, number 14, we're jumping quite a bit. We're going a few placements farther, all the way to the end of the pre-jury. Here we have Suzette. And Suzette was a player that I never looked at as that good. However, I feel like over time, with her having played other social strategy games after the fact, I feel like I kind of lessened my dislike of Suzette and kind of thought of her as maybe someone player that had a lot of potential the first time around. But then I rewatched the season and I really just don't see that. I really think Suzette's just a terrible player on the first season of BB Can. Now again, if she were to come back, maybe she would play better, but how she played the first time around was really terrible, where really someone already set up to be a relatively early boot early on, but is handed HOH. And instead of using that opportunity to create relationships, something that the first HOH is typically a very powerful position to have, and one that allows you to set up the power structure, instead she decides to nominate Tom and Emmett, two of the biggest physical threats in the game, and through that, two people that would almost always be at least in the initial power structure. And with Tom eventually obviously winning the veto, and she ends up putting up Kat, and Kat goes home, she really just leaves in two massive threats that are coming after her afterwards. And even then, her nomination of Kat doesn't really make much sense, considering Kat seemed to be willing to work with her. So again, she makes a vendetta out of Tom and Emmett, while also getting rid of a potential ally. Also, while there, she annoys most of the people in the house, to the point where by the time she goes home, everyone just simply wants to get rid of her. She obviously is going to go home during Tom's HOH week until a twist ends up saving her there. And a twist that isn't even that impressive in the way that she gets saved, because again, this is a twist where Canada had to choose between literally just the two nominees. They picked between AJ, someone who was invisible on the show up until that point, or Suzette, this massive anti-Tom figure in a position where Canada hated Tom. So obviously they were going to save her there. And again, after Tom and Liza eventually go home, she's really just the easy consensus target, where her eventual boot leads to one of the more boring weeks of the entire season, largely because she had no chance at staying. And Suzette, for me, is just a player that really had no chance on this season, but largely just because of how terrible a player she is to begin with. While she is a player that obviously comes into the game with disadvantages in being very different from the other players, you see someone like Gary come in and be able to overcome those differences. Tala's another person that was in the minority for a lot of the game and is able to still make a deep run. So I feel like the fact that Suzette is the one that they're so adamant in getting rid of over those other two, I think is a really big indictment just how much they hated her over the other two people that were outside of the majority alliance. And beyond that, again, made some very questionable strategic decisions along the way, played it very emotionally. I will say the one slight positive is that it did seem like while she failed to set herself up within any sort of power structure, she did at least seem to gain safety in week 2 due to a deal she made with Jillian in week 1, so at least that's something. But really, I do look at Suzette as still a pretty terrible player. She's here at number 14. Now, number 13, we're finally getting around to the first boot. Here we do have Kat. And truth be told, I mean, Kat could be definitely lower if we were given more information. I think the problem is that we weren't, and we barely know why she was targeted to begin with. Like, they mentioned that she was playing too hard, but we see very little of her actually playing too hard. Now, I will say that I do think her conversations with Suzette did come off as very awkward, and we do have that shot of her like proposing an all-girls alliance to where none of the women are receptive to it. So that seems pretty bad, but it did seem like Kat still had some potential allies in the game. It did seem like she was extremely close to Neil. I believe she also had a relationship with the likes of Liza. And again, we just really don't truly know why Suzette ends up putting her up, as it just really makes no sense. Which, again, in itself is actually kind of an indictment on Kat and the fact that she couldn't get Suzette to do what was in her own best interest, especially considering Suzette ends up regretting putting up Kat. But again, like, Kat to me is a bad player. It's just that we have so little information on in and outs of her game in comparison to the likes of Danielle and Suzette, who we saw a lot more of. So because of that, for me, I put Kat above them at number 13. Now, number 12, moving on to a player that I think has a lot of potential, but the game that they played on this season was pretty bad, and that does come from Liza. Now, Liza, again, I think is a decent strategic thinker. She did seem to have pretty accurate reads on the house. The problem is that she wasn't able to do really anything with them. I mean, she did clock that Quattro was together and clocked how big of a threat Emmett was, and through that does try to take out Emmett, but ends up failing, and through doing so ends up becoming on the bottom, despite having ins into the majority alliance in the likes of Tom and Peter. Liza obviously becomes a major source of conflict within the Quattro, to where a lot of Tom's downward spiral is him continuing to defend Liza, which I guess you give her credit for having Tom continuously defend her in that way, but also just shows how resolute they were in wanting Liza out. Again, like, I do think Liza is a player that does have potential in the game. Again, she does seem to know what she's supposed to do. It's just that it seems like she can rarely ever execute on what she wants to do, where despite her having these one-on-one bonds with the likes of Jillian and Neil and Tom and Peter and Tala and seemingly Kat right away, it's like she has these relationships, but they end up doing very little to actually benefit her in the game, and she's not able to get them to go against the likes of Emmett when she wants them to. She isn't even able to get the likes of Gary, someone that she was actually truthful with in his HOH week and did do a lot to save Gary. She wasn't even able to get him to want to keep her around, and she ends up becoming his initial target. And like, I do feel like there is some potential with Liza. It's just that nothing she does on the season ends up working out, and because of that, for me, I can't put her too high. She's at number 12. Now, number 11, a pretty bad player all around, but one that was at least in a kind of power position for a bit, and that person is obviously Tom. And again, I think Tom all around is probably just outright a bad player. I think he's too loyal to a fault, to the point where he obviously didn't suspect that he was getting betrayed by the Quattro. He also is a bit too cocky in the game, and once he got HOH, he really just let the power get to his head. He's also a very emotional player. It's like, these are all very bad things. However, the thing about Tom is that I do feel like he does somewhat effective work in week 1. I mean, immediately after being targeted by Suzette, which also is something to mention here, is how a lot of this perception of him being this big threat is perpetuated by how he was instantly nominated by Suzette. So if it wasn't for the fact that Suzette forced him to play the game right away and forced him to win that veto and play extremely aggressively, maybe he wouldn't be in the position that he ends up being. But because he is forced to play a bit harder, which I will say again, I do think he sets himself up pretty well in week 1. Again, he becomes part of the Quattro, to which he has a final 2 with Emmett. He obviously has a relationship with Liza. He also has a good relationship with the likes of Tala, and eventually builds one for Neil. It's like he does do some good relationship building early on while in power. The problem is that obviously he's not able to hold that power, and once he does become HOH, he becomes so resolute in targeting Suzette, mind you, because of how poorly Suzette was playing in that week too, and wanting to target Tom. But that, and then also his relationship with Liza, and how much Liza was against the likes of Emmett, obviously causes a massive fracture within the Quattro, to where he becomes the target for the following round. Though at the same time, again, like, there is bad social play along the way. I mean, Tom is also just kind of a dick, where I feel like most people end up getting annoyed at him at certain points in the game. I think he's someone that is a bit abrasive. He's not willing to back down when he sees something that he doesn't agree with. And that obviously ends up leading up to Emmett's decision to eventually cut him, to where he looks at him as a loose cannon. So again, all that is pretty bad. But he also kind of gets screwed in his HOH week, where he does end up having his big target in Suzette getting saved, leading to him taking out Neil, who was a potential ally for him, which again, like, technically he gets manipulated by Emmett in order to do so, but still, again, that shouldn't have been a position that he was in to begin with. And realistically, I mean, like, does that change that much? Probably not, considering Gary was the HOH to take him out, though, to be fair, also, he does use the veto on Gary without the context of the later power shift, where if Gary had been eligible to be put up at the end of week 3, I do think there's a chance he goes through with that, though realistically, he also had to deal with Gary, so probably not, but again, there's at least a chance. And even then, I mean, the week that he goes home was actually an HOH won by Emmett, however, Emmett gets DQ'd for cheating, so again, that's also kind of an unlucky circumstance for Tom, and really, again, like, I just think Tom, despite how poorly he plays at points, how egotistical he is, how bad he is socially at points, he actually didn't play that terrible of a game, to where, again, he was in a decent spot early on, despite obviously being looked at as a figurehead, and even beyond that, he just gets so unlucky with so many other things that go on in the game. So again, for me, I still have him relatively high here at number 11. Now, number 10, we're moving on to the first jury member on the board, and this is really someone that I have very little to say about, and that is AJ. I mean, AJ was there. He was the pawn star. There's really not much else to say. I don't think AJ had any shot at winning the game unless he was at the end against, like, maybe a Tala or maybe a Jillian that everyone hated. But, like, I don't think there's any way AJ's winning the game. Even beyond that, the fact that they keep Andrew in the game over AJ, despite Andrew being consistently looked at as a threat, is pretty bad. But really, AJ had not much going on in the game. I mean, he did have a relationship with the likes of Andrew and Tala, and they were mostly there for the first half of the game. I mean, they were really just coasting along for a bit. Though, again, at the end of the day, AJ was screwed over by the instant eviction, a situation where, had there been more time, I do think the likes of Peter and Alec may have realized how bad of a move it was for them to get rid of AJ. So that is definitely an aspect here, but considering how, again, I don't think he had any win equity, and also he really was just not playing the game that hard, and had no real path to the end outside of being this massive GOAT, I do still have to land him at number 10. Now, number 9, we're going to the earliest boot left on the board, someone that I think was massively screwed over, and that person is Neil. Again, Neil's a player that I think demonstrates some pretty good game ability. Like, while there was some poor game ability, and the fact that he very openly talked about recognizing that there was the Quattro and wanting to target them, to which he becomes the target for week 2, he was still able to get himself out of that position, though, to be fair, some of that is also the poor play of Danielle. And to go along with that, he does do a lot of things in week 1 to try to put the target on Gary, and also tries to keep Kat safe, and really ends up failing in both of those things. However, it seemed like he was on the upward trajectory by the time he went home. Again, in week 3, he was actually starting to get in a solid spot, to where, yes, he was still on the bottom, but he was building a strong relationship with Liza and Tom, and also with Peter and Alec, to where I do feel like if he had made it a few more rounds into the game, he would have been able to worm his way into a pretty deep run, but obviously that gets cut short due to the power shift, and really just Suzette being saved because Canada hated Tom. And even in that position, again, Tom wasn't given much time to really work through what he wanted to do, and puts up a Neil, who was a close ally of his because Emmett told him to. And it's like, again, like, I do feel like it's a lot of unlucky circumstances. He was just really screwed in that situation where there really wasn't much time for him to actually do anything. And while, yes, you could say that he should have positioned himself better coming into that round, he was in a position where he didn't really have any reason to believe he needed to do anything that drastic, considering how unlikely of a twist that is. And he was on the upward trajectory over the course of the last week, to where who knows where he would have been coming into the following round. So I really do feel like Neil got screwed over here, because that, for me, he's here at number 9. Now, number 8, we're moving on to the first player of the final 8 that we're going to be talking about, and that is someone I considered putting higher, but I didn't, and that person is Topaz. And Topaz is an interesting player to me because I do think there are massive pros and cons for Topaz's game. I think Topaz actually ended up being a better player on the rewatch than I remembered. I do feel like she had a decent strategic mind for the game. I feel like she understood the game, but was obviously just like outside of the core power structure, to where the likes of Alec and Peter never really looped her in on all the information until the very end of her run. And really, as it is with a lot of the people we're about to be talking about, they all get outplayed by Jillian and Emmett. But I mean, Topaz also gets screwed over by the instant eviction. Again, she wins HOH. They end up leaking everything she says in the HOH room, which is unfair, but realistically, I don't know how much of a major factor that really played. I think really at the end of the day, I think the biggest factor in all of this is, one, not getting time to campaign after making her nom, where I do think, again, like, this was in the best interest of Peter and Alec to keep AJ around, and I think they probably would have got a sense of that had they been given more time to think about it, but just weren't given that time. And I think even beyond that, Topaz really just did not have a strong relationship with Alec as she should have at this point in the game. So that's obviously like a major reason why their games completely crumble at that point. Or again, after losing AJ, her and Gary become the bigger targets on the board, and while she is saved over Gary, she's still on the bottom, and at that point obviously is just forced to go back to Peter and Alec, but there really wasn't much maneuvering for her afterwards. But obviously we gotta talk about her eventual boot round in the double eviction, where Peter ends up getting the veto and decides to not use it on her, which I do think is bad on Peter's end, but it's also really bad on Topaz's end that Peter decided that he is closer to Emmett than he is to Topaz, which I really think shows you that she dropped the ball in her relationship with Peter. So again, I think there's a lot of like mixed things throughout her game. I do think early on she was decently positioned, while not in the core power structure, wasn't ever really targeted. She proceeds to have like a decent strategic mind, even though she was like perceived to be doing absolutely nothing. And then obviously she gets screwed over by the instant eviction. But beyond that, I think just failed to build the relationships that she needed to progress in the game. And because of that, for me, she's here number 8. Now, number 7, we're moving on to someone that is very strange to rank here, because I think this is a player that probably was the most useless in this entire game. Didn't really bring much to the table from a game perspective, however, also came very close to winning the game, and that person is Tala. And again, Tala straight up was pretty ineffective in the game. I mean, she was on the bottom for a lot of the early portions of the game, to where while she wasn't targeted over the likes of like Danielle and Gary and Suzette, she was never really included in any of the majority's plans. It was deemed as the consensus target coming into the instant eviction by a lot of the house, though realistically, none of that probably would have happened, considering I feel like the only person I think would have fallen back in targeting Tala would have been someone like an Alec at that point. But she does get saved in that final 9 round through her relationship with Topaz, so again, credit to her there, I guess. And following that, she's brought into the East Coasters alliance with Jillian, Emmett, and Andrew as a 4th in their alliance. And from that point forward is kind of just dragged in the game. I mean, she doesn't really do much. She doesn't really have that much agency or control over anything that's going on in the game. But she's there. She's in the majority. Even though Emmett decides to use her as her pawn instead of Peter, and then later on, there are talks about keeping Peter around over her, and this all leads up to her eventually being booted at the final 4 over Gary, which seems ridiculous on paper, though there is some merit to it in the sense that, again, they expected the first part of the HOH to be something very endurance-based, which they were worried that Tala could beat Jillian in that, and then obviously Emmett was worried that if Tala won final HOH, she would have voted him out. So, again, there is some merit to the decision at the end there, though obviously based on the comps that we saw, we would find out that, yeah, they made the wrong decision. But again, there's no way for them to know that at that point. But again, it's a very mediocre game with her really not having much influence over the game and being perceived to be the biggest GOAT in the game. The issue is that she wasn't. And I mean, this is such a strange thing to assess because, again, this is not due to anything Tala actually did, but she was actually the biggest jury threat out of her entire alliance. Where, again, we know about this agreement that was made in the jury house, where Alec, Peter, Topaz, and AJ made an agreement for them to be the deciders in the jury vote, and through that, they did not want any of Jillian, Emmett, or Andrew to win the game, and if any of them had taken Tala to the end, they would have voted for Tala, despite them even thinking that Tala was the worst player. Which, again, is really more so negatives for the other people than it is a pro for Tala, where really they are voting for Tala because of how bad she is and wanting to make a mockery of the situation. So again, like, I do have to give some credibility to that in the sense that, again, Tala was the biggest jury threat. She was probably going to win the game if she got to the end against anybody but Gary. But again, it's due to absolutely nothing that she actually did. So because of that, for me, I'm still leaving here number 7. Now, number 6. This is a very weird placement, considering this person should have won the game. But they also shouldn't have, and that person is Gary. And again, Gary's so tough to assess on this season. I do think as a whole, I do think Gary is a pretty solid player on this season. But again, when assessing their games, I do think you have to obviously factor in the fact that he was voted out and had to come back into the game. In a position where he came back at the final 4, ends up winning the veto at the final 5 round, to where he's safe there also. Now, his early game is very rocky. He's kind of on the outs for first couple rounds, though through his comp ability, he's eventually brought in as being looked at as someone that is a potential weapon for them, where the likes of Alec and Peter bring him in to try to get him to target Tom and Liza, while Tom and Liza try to bring him in and use him as a number as well. So again, like, it does start off very rocky, but it does end up being pretty good for him by the time of week 3. But then week 4, he does win HOH and decides to target Tom and Liza, which he calls his biggest move of the season. However, I don't know if it's the right move for him. I mean, Tom is someone that was actually loyal to him at that point. Well, not loyal to him more so than the likes of Liza or Emmett, but Tom is someone that when he makes a deal with you, he is going to stick with it. And for him to target, again, Tom there in that position, and also Liza, a person that went out of her way to try to save Gary in week 3, it is kind of a ridiculous situation there to me. Now, realistically, where does he actually go? I do think it's kind of tough to find, because like at the end of the day, it's like, yeah, Peter and Alec were working with him at that point. He obviously has a relationship with Topaz. He has a relationship with Tala, and Suzette also had a relationship through Emmett, and through that couldn't really target Jillian. So really at that point, we're saying it's really only AJ and Andrew that he could nominate, which, I mean, like, Andrew would not have been a bad target for him there, but also when the likes of Alec and Peter were so anti-Tom at that point, and there was this general anti-Tom and Liza consensus, I do think it's kind of a tough decision for what he should actually do in that position. Though I do think at the end of the day, again, like, I think he probably just should have gone for Andrew, especially considering what ends up happening to him later in the game. But again, he gets unlucky with the instant eviction twist, where that kind of screws him over just as much as it does Topaz, causing Alec and Peter to flip over to side with Emmett and Jillian, and through that, he becomes the biggest target once Andrew ends up winning HOH and ends up going home, to which he eventually obviously comes back. However, when coming back, he does do good work in getting Emmett back on his side, to the point where Emmett believes that Gary is going to take him in the final 2. And the thing is, Gary was. Despite we see the fact that Gary does take Jillian at the very end, Gary did come into the house actually planning on taking Emmett to the end. The thing that changes everything is when Dan Giesling comes into the house and tells Gary to be a more manipulative figure and tells him to watch out for Emmett. To where while Gary initially turns away that concept, you can tell, like, the more and more he thinks about it, the more and more his mind starts to shift. And now, realistically, again, would it have shifted anyway? We don't know, considering, again, he did know how much of a goat Jillian was, so maybe he would have eventually changed his mind naturally, but it did very much feel like the influence of Dan is what really sparked the idea to get rid of Emmett, though realistically, none of that matters anyway, as he beats both of them, and really he beats anybody at the end if he gets there. Though I do think, like, when people say that he was, like, manipulating Emmett to take him to the end, I don't think that's really the case, considering I do think he was truthful with Emmett and wanting to take Emmett to the end of the game. It's just that he eventually changed his mind. And again, we do see that allowing him to get through the final 4 round, which is actually pretty impressive. Again, the fact that he's able to stay over Tala is impressive, though again, I already said, like, I do think there's some rationale, especially from Emmett, to be getting rid of Tala in that position. And realistically, again, now knowing what we know from a jury, it doesn't matter that much anyway, outside of future compatibility, considering Jillian and Emmett lose to both of them anyway, so they both need to get to the end together, which through that, again, like, based on the position that they were at, which makes Tala the person that would probably be the best to take in that position, but again, that's something that he couldn't really have known. And again, like, Gary was going to be someone that would have won the game, had it not been for Topaz's mistake, which essentially makes him the winner of the season. I mean, truth be told, he is essentially the winner of this season. While he doesn't have the official title or got the money, he essentially won the game. He is the person that the jury technically voted for. It's really an error of how people had to submit their votes that made him lose. Because again, like, for the sake of this player ranking and for assessments of them as players, really all that matters is the intentionality of the jury, not the practicality of how the jury voted. Because again, at the end of the day, Topaz had every intention of voting for Gary. Again, for all intents and purposes, I mean, Gary is the winner of this season, but even if he was, he would have been a pretty bad one in my eyes. And based on how I assessed the game, again, he is a player that got voted out and came back into the game. After coming back to the game, he had immunity for 2 of the 3 rounds that he was in following that. And even then really would win a jury vote simply because he spent time with the jury, mixed in with the fact that they were extremely angry at the other players in the game, in Jillian and Emmett, which is more so a negative against them than it is really a pro against Gary. So again, for me, it's like, I think Gary has a very complex game here. It's one of the toughest games to truly assess because for all intents and purposes, he is a winner. However, he is also a winner that got voted out, didn't technically win, and even despite that, would have won in a very fluky way. So because of that, for me, again, I find it tough to really rank Gary that high, even though I don't think he is that bad of a player. But for me on this ranking, he lands here number 6. Now number 5, we're moving on to a player that I know a lot of people talk about how overrated these players are, and I do agree based on the edit, but I don't think they're as bad as people say. At number 5, we're going with Alec Beal, who again, like, I think Alec is a player that is way too cocky about his game. I do think the way that the Shield talks about their games in the DR is obviously way better than what it was in reality. However, the Shield did have a lot of power early on in the game. I mean, no matter how you want to shake it, I mean, the Shield was in the center of the house. I mean, they were part of Quattro, and through that had a lot of power there. They then had numerous relationships within the rest of the house, from the likes of Andrew and AJ. They had a relationship with Neil. They had a relationship with Gary and Topaz. Like, they were very well positioned early on in the game. Like, there was no talks about targeting them up until the first double eviction. And I do think that is where we start to see the big holes in Alec's game, where he is just way too blatantly playing the game. He is someone that, again, just openly throws the competition to where everyone sees what he's doing, and through that comes off as an extremely sketchy figure there, someone that is playing the game too hard. And considering the fact that he then proceeds to win the following HOH, it really ends up becoming a pretty bad look for him. Also, even before that, I do think him getting rid of Tom in the position that he did was a pretty misguided move for him. I think it is him getting rid of a shield for him in the game, to where while Tom was aligned with Liza, I don't really see why they had to get rid of Tom in that position. I get that they wanted to build some social capital with the rest of the house by looking like the people in charge of getting rid of Tom, and through that gaining some favor, but I don't feel like that was worth losing a number that would have been loyal to them until the point that they betrayed him. So I do feel like that was a bit of a misguided move from my point of view. But really, like, at the end of the day, it didn't really matter too much. I mean, really, the make or break for his game was the instant eviction. At the instant eviction, obviously, Topaz nominates Andrew and AJ. And if he had taken out Andrew in that position, Alec would have been in a very good position moving forward. He would have had, obviously, his relationship with Peter. And through that, they would have also had the final four that they had with Topaz and Gary, which would have essentially been the position that Emmett and Jillian end up becoming in moving forward. But his is even better in the sense that he's in the center of multiple duos in that position, where he has his duo of Peter, his duo with Topaz. Also, AJ is someone that was closer to the likes of Alec and Peter than they were to Jillian and Emmett. It's like, to me, it is a pretty astronomically bad move there for him to get rid of AJ over Andrew, as he would have just outright had the majority if he went the other way, as really at that point, Emmett and Jillian would have been just simply on the outs. Considering even in that position, Tala was closer to AJ at that point than she was to Jillian. So really, that was the game-ending move for me. Again, like, that is a very bad decision. I think that is a decision that causes a lot of people to call them really bad players, when again, to me, it's simply one bad decision. It's like, that doesn't change the fact that they had some game acumen outside that. They just made a really terrible decision there. And moving forward, obviously, like, they get rid of Gary, which through doing so is getting rid of another shield for him and also another loyal number to them. Though, to be fair, Gary also had connections to Emmett, but also that's not what they were thinking about when voting Gary out. And then he's obviously booed in the following round, just simply being out of the numbers by that point, with Emmett and Jillian clearly targeting them. Though we do have another dumb move from him and him throwing the veto, though really it's like, I don't have that much of an issue with it, in the sense that, one, he's throwing it to Peter, who is also an ally, so really he's more so banking this position on him being able to save himself more so than Peter would be able to, which I do think is misguided, but it's not like the worst move in the world. Though, again, at the end of the day, it is pretty much sealing his fate there. But again, like, I do think overall, like, Alec is a player with a lot of potential. I do think he is a player that did demonstrate a lot of strong gameplay early on, though obviously just misses his opportunity to flip the game in his favor, largely because he just trusted Emmett way too much. And because that, for me, he is still a solid player, but one that made a really bad mistake, and he lands here number 5. Now, number 4, we're moving on to a player that I am kind of conflicted on, in the sense that I do think this person on paper played a decent game, but knowing the fact that they had very little win equity in the game and mixing that in with the fact that they were a bit too blindly loyal in the game as well. And at number 4, I do have Andrew. And Andrew's a player, I do think my latest rewatch kind of knocked me a bit down on him as a player. Not too much, to where, again, if I were to redo my ranking of every BB Can player, he would still probably be around the same spot, just a few spots lower. But Andrew, I think, is a player that, again, is good at competitions. He did prove to be probably the best competitor on the season outside of Jillian and Emmett. He was also good enough socially to where people liked him while in the house, though the level of respect that they had for him is a bit questionable. And then strategically, he was solid. Like, he wasn't an all-time great strategist by any means, but I do think he had a decent understanding of the game, but also was kind of one note in the sense that I do feel like he was a bit too loyal to the likes of Jillian and Emmett. But really, Andrew, again, kind of like AJ and Tala, like, they didn't really have much to do early on in the game. I mean, he wasn't playing poorly, where he was doing decent jobs at making relationships and kind of just playing the middle, but he wasn't really doing much actively. And there was a point where Tom did actually want to come after him. So again, that wasn't great. And even following that, he did eventually become a target for Gary and Topaz, but he did do a good job at building relationships with the people that were at the core of the main power structure, the likes of Alec and Peter and Jillian and Emmett. And obviously ends up getting saved at the instant eviction, largely due to his relationships with Jillian and Emmett and their influence convincing Alec and Peter to keep him around. Only from then to take out Gary, and then part of the flip against Alec and Peter, to where he aligns with Jillian and Emmett, and they decide to make a final 3 that Andrew seemed to be pretty loyal to. So while there were points where he did mention the concept of taking Tala to the final 2, I do think Andrew truly intended to go to the final 3 with Jillian and Emmett, where he would have taken Jillian to the end, to which he would have won the game in that situation. I think the problem is that that's probably the only situation he wins. Where again, like, we had this pact from the jury to where they didn't want to reward any of Jillian, Emmett, or Andrew the win, and through that, Jillian was the person they least wanted to reward the win, and through that, Andrew and Emmett both have winning scenarios in that case, to where if they got to the end with Jillian, they would win the game. I don't 100% know who would win between Emmett and Andrew, though realistically that wasn't ever happening, so really it's not even that important to figure it out. But Andrew is someone that at least I will give him credit for, he was trying to get to the scenario where he was going to win the game. He was trying to get to a scenario with Jillian to where he would have won. Mind you, he didn't know that, as he assumed he would have beaten Tala and didn't want to take Tala because of his agreement more so than her beatability. But I mean, the reason why Andrew is probably a knock below where I used to rank him is because I do feel like he does seem to get pretty lucky in the game at multiple instances, is because I do feel like his blind loyalty is something that is really misguided in this season, where you can really tell how much he was banking on Emmett wanting to take him to 3, despite Emmett having multiple signs of him not thinking that way. And we do have him winning the veto during Peter's boot week, to where I do feel like Andrew more than likely would have gone home had he not won the veto in that position. And also even in his eventual boot week, while Gary does win the veto, which makes it a clear-cut case that Andrew would go home over Tala, I think more than likely he goes home over Gary in that position too. So really, I just feel like he was in this position of needing to win out from pretty far back, to which I don't think he would have been able to do it. And even beyond that, he only wins in one scenario, despite needing that trajectory as well. So I do feel like that's pretty bad. And because of that, for me, I did knock Andrew a bit lower than what I used to, and he's here number 4. Now number 3, we're moving on to another player that I think gets trashed on a bit too much. Again, while they're not as good of a player as what they claim to be, I do feel like at the end of the day, they are a better player than what many other people claim them to be. And at number 3, I do have Peter Brown, who again is extremely annoying in his confessionals at how cocky he is in the game. Again, really most of his game is very similar to Alec, though a bit below it in the sense of Alec being probably someone that had more respect in the game, where like I think Alec is someone that would probably beat Peter in a jury vote, though I do think Peter is probably actually the better player. Now, back in my BB Can player ranking, where I ranked every player in the history of the show, I did end up having Alec and Peter back-to-back on that list. And I do think after my latest rewatch of BB Can 1, I would really change that up. I really do feel like Peter is actually a much better player than Alec. I do think Peter demonstrated a lot of good social ability throughout the season, where, again, like a lot of his game early on is very similar to where he is in the same position as Alec for a lot of the game, though Alec is the one that's looked at as the bigger threat. And again, through that has more respect in the game, but also would more likely go home before Peter. However, Peter also has very strong relationships that Alec didn't have, particularly the likes of Liza, and like Alec, makes the dumb move to vote out AJ that really does sink his game, but even then, he's not even doomed. Where, yeah, he gets nominated on the block against Alec in the final 7 round, but Alec was the target there, and even if Alec had won the veto, Peter was still not going home. The plan was to take out Topaz in that situation, and we do later see in the double eviction where Emmett keeps Peter off the block in what is a pretty dumb move for Emmett in that position, to where Peter would have had the opportunity to completely flip the game and take control of the game, only for Peter to actually be in that scenario where he wins the veto and then not do it, which again is also the other flaw that people point out with Peter, is that, oh, what an idiot for not using the veto on Topaz, which again, yeah, he should have. But, I mean, one, again, he's completely being outplayed by Emmett, but two, Emmett's not even necessarily being untruthful to him at that point, where Emmett was conflicted over whether to take Andrew or Peter to the final 3. There were points where they thought about taking Peter to the final 3, which at that point, Peter would be one competition away from winning the game. So while yes, it was a dumb move, in my opinion, to get rid of Topaz in that situation, it's not even then a game-ending move. Now, again, like if he did use the veto, he would have been in a very good position, where if he used the veto, at that point, Andrew goes home, as it would have been Andrew and Tala on the block. At that point, Tala would have been upset with Emmett, so Peter would have been able to pick her up there, and also they would have had Topaz. They would have been 3 of the final 5, and that would have been a very good position for Peter to be in. But again, even despite that, comes very close to staying in the final 5 round, where Emmett did want to keep Peter around over Tala, for a bit, and even convinced Jillian to do so for a bit, but eventually that plan doesn't go through. But again, if it did, Peter would have been in a very strong position once again, to where at that point Gary would have came back into the game, and Peter would have instantly been able to click with Gary. And while again, like knowing the comp results of Jillian and Emmett winning back-to-back HOHs, it probably wouldn't have helped him too much, but it still would have put him in a decent position before knowing the comp results there. So again, like I feel like Peter is a player that is a bit misunderstood, to where I do feel like his game is constantly trashed on because of 2 major decisions that he makes that were pretty bad. Also him being so braggadocious about his game, and also his massive amount of bitterness towards the end. But I think as a game player within the season, I do think he is actually way better than people give him credit for. Though again, probably not as good as he thinks he is. So because that for me, Peter's here number 3. Now number 2, we are moving on to the sort of winner of the season, and here we do have Jillian. And Jillian is a player that I think if it wasn't for the fact that she had 0 win equity, I think you could have been able to convince me to put her at number 1 at this point. Where I do think on the rewatch, I actually did find Jillian to be probably a better player than I remembered in terms of the social strategy aspects of the game. While not perfect, I do feel like she did have a pretty good social game with people while in the house. Now again, her jury management is abysmal. The way she handles people on the way out and making deals with them and constantly breaking them, and even beyond that, not even being able to own up to the fact that she's doing that, I think that's all pretty bad. And that does lose her to the jury votes of someone like a Peter and an Alec and a Topaz, where again, like obviously they were bitter and they did create this pact so that she wouldn't win the game, but it's like they had every right to do so. I mean, yes, it is a bad look for them, but in the context of the game, they had the right to do it, and they did, mainly because of how poorly Jillian had played. But again, outside of the jury management aspect of it, I do feel like Jillian plays a solid game. Now, obviously, initially, she's not in the core power structure of the Quattro, but she is obviously aligned with Emmett, and actually does some decent maneuvering early on in suspecting that Emmett might not be fully loyal to her, to where she does build this alliance with Liza for them to watch each other's back. She does have a good relationship with Danielle. Like, she does have good relationships early on that she had as a backup in the case that Emmett wasn't fully loyal to her. The problem is that she does eventually drop them because of Emmett, particularly the Liza relationship, which, again, not great. But I think the fact that she was able to build these relationships and these backup plans is a pretty big pro for her, even though obviously once her relationship with Emmett gets more serious, she does end up pretty much just blindly following him for a while. But again, it is her relationships that do cause this new majority alliance to form after the instant eviction, where while I think you do have to credit Emmett for the strategy aspects of it, in the sense of like recognizing, okay, these are the people we need to get together, I do think Jillian's relationships to them is really what keeps them in line. The likes of Andrew and Tala, it's like they had closer relationships to Jillian than they had to Emmett, which is probably one of the downsides of Emmett's game that we will eventually talk about. But Jillian actually comes into the endgame in a very solid position, to where Andrew, Tala, and Emmett are all taking her to Final 2. To where if it wasn't for Gary coming back into the game, she would have been absolutely locked to make Final 2. The problem is the win equity, which she had none. And straight up, again, she is a runner-up for all intents and purposes. She did not win the game from a more conceptual point of view. Again, like, she did not technically get the jury votes to win the game. It was really by accident that she did. And really, I am basing this assessment off of a runner-up game, considering really that is the game she played. Because really, it's again, like, she had 3 locked jury votes in most scenarios. The problem is that she could never get the 4th. Is that she was always getting the votes of Emmett, Tala, and Andrew, but she was never getting the votes of Peter, Topaz, Alec, or AJ. It was even pretty unlikely to get Gary's in most situations. While that is a pro to her relationships that she had with the people within her alliance, it's also a massive knock against the relationships that she had outside of her alliance. To her, again, her jury management with them was pretty abysmal. And again, by the end game, despite her getting into the end game in a position where she has all these people that are wanting to take her to the end, she ends up going along with Emmett and getting rid of those people, getting rid of Andrew and Tala over the likes of Gary, which obviously it works out for her accidentally, but really she was just minimizing the chance that she gets the Final 2 through doing so. So again, it is a largely conflicting game. I do think her social relationships within the house were definitely a lot better than I remembered. She's obviously really physical throughout the game as well. However, I do think it was a bit too passive in terms of her relationship with Emmett in letting him get his way at multiple points across the season. Though, to be fair, she does get her way in the Peter boot, so minor credit there. But again, like, at the end of the day, good game, but one that should have been a losing game, and because of that, she's here at number 2. At number 1, the best player from BB Can 1 is still Emmett. And I've always said it was Emmett. However, I will say my latest rewatch has made me go down on Emmett as a player. While I still think he played a very, very strong game, by far the best game of the season, and still is an elite BB Can player, he also has a lot more flaws than I remembered. I mean, obviously he's very hot-headed and obviously gets caught for cheating in comps multiple times, and that's something to point out. But also, he's really just a cold individual. I mean, the lack of remorse that he shows across this season outside of situations that benefit his later jury management is actually really humorous to see, but I do think makes it like a question mark of like, how did he build these relationships with these people? And it really makes me think of him as like the Sarah Lucina of Big Brother, where Sarah Lucina in Survivor is a player that everyone that spent time with her on the island talks about how great of a social player she was, where everyone was just magnetized towards her to the point where when they're blindsided by Sarah, they're really deeply hurt by it. And to be honest, Emmett is really the Big Brother version of that. I mean, he built such strong relationships with most of the house. And the likes of Gary, Peter, Alec, Andrew and AJ, Ozzy, Tom. I mean, like, these are all people that 100% thought they had Emmett's loyalty, only for him to stab him in the back. And then we do see the bitterness that exudes from the likes of Alec and Peter. And even Tala is probably someone that wasn't going to vote for Emmett at the end. And while, again, there is some poor jury management at points with them, I do think a lot of it stems to them just truly feeling betrayed due to how close a relationship they thought that they had. And really, again, like, Emmett for me is a very domineering player here. I do think he played an extremely dominant game. However, I am a bit more conflicted on a lot of decisions he makes across the season at this point. To where, again, he obviously gets rid of Tom extremely early in the game in a position that I really do not think that was in his best interest. And while most of the house was already against Tom at that point, I do think he could have easily just still kept the votes onto Liza and try to keep Tom in a bit longer, but decides to just let him go in that position. Also, his decision to not put Peter on the block during the double eviction was a very questionable move as well, where it obviously opens up the scenario to where Peter could have really just screwed over Emmett in that position, making him get rid of Andrew and allowing Peter to really run the game from that point. But Emmett does do good work in convincing Peter to not use the veto, which obviously stems to the fact that he didn't nominate him. But again, he wouldn't have been in that position to begin with if he just nominated him. And also, he doesn't get his way the following round where he wants to save Peter and ends up having to let him go there. And even in these following positions, where he is going all out and having a lot of control in getting Jillian to go along with getting rid of Andrew and Tala over the likes of Gary, in a position where Gary is being kept around so clearly to benefit Emmett's game, is again impressive in terms of his control over the game. But again, like the decision to keep Tala over Gary, like while I do see merit to it, and I think you definitely see merit to it in a position where they don't know what the future comps will be, it is, at the end of the day, a game-ending choice for him. And again, considering that Gary's comp ability has always been better than the likes of Tala's, I do think it makes you scratch your head on, like, was that even understandable to begin with? And obviously he does end up getting voted out by Gary at the end, though realistically it would have been bad even if Gary had taken Emmett to the end, because in that position Emmett would have lost in a bigger margin than what Jillian was supposed to, considering Tala probably would have voted for Gary in that situation, and Emmett at best gets 2 votes from Jillian and Andrew. And it's like, again, those are issues there, but at the end of the day, again, like Emmett still wanted to go with Jillian. That was his true final 2, to which he would have beaten Jillian in a jury vote. And again, just the outright control he had for a lot of the game is very impressive, though again, I do find a lot more question marks with decisions he makes, and also I do find his hot-headed nature to be something that can probably bite him in the grand scheme of Big Brother. But again, over the course of how he played in this season, I think it's far and away the best game played on this season, so because that, for me, he's here number 1. But there we go, I mean, that is my ranking of every player from BB Can 1. Now next year I'll be doing a similar thing for BB Can 2, so stay tuned for that. Also, in terms of BBUS, I will be doing the same thing for Big Brother 4 later in the year, and there's other retrospectives and player rankings like this down the road. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.